There are two things that have been constant throughout history: taxes and broken marriages. I dedicate this video to the harlots of the past. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the channel where I, a real-life lawyer, examine the laws of history. Today's topic: the criminalization of adultery in ancient Rome. If Adam Levine were a Roman, he would have been in a lot of trouble. Prior to the age of Augustus, that is before 0 AD, and for those of you who are bad at math like me, more than 2,023 years ago, sexual offenses such as adultery were dealt with within the Roman household. That is to say, they were private matters. There's one thing that I would like for you to keep in mind throughout the course of this video. During this time, and even after, the father or husband reigned supreme. He had the power of life and death over his daughter or wife. For example, if a man's daughter was caught having clandestine relations with a man who was not her husband, both could be killed. There were specific rules that applied to this that I will explain later. Similar punishment could be wrought onto a man who slept with a married woman and was caught by her husband. In this instance, the husband rarely killed his wife, but would normally kill the man. If for some reason the man got away, word would surely spread of his conduct and he would inevitably be discovered, whereupon he would be torn to pieces by the bystanders. The point is that adultery was not a crime prior to the age of the empire. It was a family matter. Ignoring the right to slaughter people, the non-criminal nature of cheating is similar to that of the American system. Now, there are several states such as Arizona, Florida, and New York that criminalize adultery, but prosecutions are exceedingly rare, and the parties will generally sort it out amongst themselves and get a divorce. This all changed in around 16 or 17 AD when the Roman Emperor, Augustus, well into his rule as the first de facto Roman emperor, passed a series of moral laws. His lex Julia, as it was known, made adultery illegal and set up separate courts intended to hear sex cases. By way of definition, adultery, generally speaking, was a crime involving a married woman sleeping with some man other than her husband. Both parties would be charged with adultery, as no one person could do it on his or her own. In order to be found guilty of committing adultery, the parties needed to have intended to do it. This precludes the crime of rape, which had its own punishments, but rape was very hard to prove in ancient Rome as it required some indication of violence. Without violence, consent was often inferred. Along with the act of adultery itself being illegal, it was also illegal to help people commit adultery, say by knowingly loaning a friend a place to consummate the illicit relationship, or by bribing people to keep it a secret. If the woman was unmarried, a man could be charged with debauchery if he, without the use of force, violated her virginity, or alternatively, violated a widow of respectable character. I note that a man who violated young boys or freedmen could also be charged with debauchery. Now, interestingly, a man having relations with his own slave was not a crime. However, someone having relations with somebody else's slave was treated as theft because slaves were property, and there were separate crimes on the books for corrupting the innocence of slaves. Female slaves were unable to commit adultery by definition. Male slaves, due to biological differences, could be charged with adultery if they were caught with the woman of the house or with another married woman. The important takeaway here is that a married man was essentially free to have relations with whomever so he pleased, be it female or male, so long as they were of a similar class. Now, homosexuality was technically illegal, but I'll get into that in another video. For the purposes of this one, it was tolerated. By modern standards, this one-sidedness may seem rather unfair. That's because it was, but there was some semblance of fairness. The lawyers watching this video will be familiar with the so-called clean hands doctrine. For those of you who don't practice law, the clean hands doctrine is simply calling somebody out for being a hypocritical asshole. Based on text from the time, it appears that a husband's own infidelity precluded him from accusing his wife of the same. In these cases, the man would have no legal recourse. Now, back to the killing. It's important to note that even under Augustus's laws, the paterfamilias still had the power to kill people. The laws functioned in such a way as to provide the father with immunity. However, the laws did set forth more specific rules required to gain this immunity, whereas in the past, the father simply had free reign. For example, under the lex Julia, the father had to kill his daughter and her lover at the same time, as if with the same blow. If for some reason he only killed one, it would be murder. There were also specific rules applying to where the act took place. The adultery must have taken place in the father's house, or if the daughter was married, the son-in-law's house. In the event that one of them escaped but the father intended to kill the other, as long as the other was killed in some sort of continuous pursuit, it was fine for purposes of conferring immunity. By contrast, the husband could only kill his wife's lover. He could not kill his wife. And that is only if he caught them in the act, in his home, and if the man was of a lower class. And by lower class, I want you to think gladiator, not Brad Pitt, or a prostitute. Again, please do not think of Brad Pitt. Killing his wife would be murder. If he accidentally killed her, the provocation of witnessing the adultery could be considered a mitigating circumstance at the time of his trial. The husband was also subject to some strange time rules. For example, if the husband caught his wife sleeping with another and decided not to kill the lover immediately, he could only detain the lover for 20 hours for use as evidence. If the lover escaped, he had 20 hours to find him to interrogate him. After the 20 hours, he had no recourse. It looks like that this requirement was dropped later on, but it was important to at least attempt some sort of resistance, for doing nothing, as you will see later, was greatly frowned upon. A man who did nothing in the face of being dishonored was seen as a meek weeble and could be accused of pimping out his wife. If you are not confused, please prepare to be. Assuming the woman lived, the father could bring a charge of adultery against his daughter. The husband could only bring a charge of adultery if he divorced the woman within 3 days, the logic being, why the hell would he stay with her? If the man lived, a charge could be brought against him as well. The Augustan laws prescribed a 60-day priority reporting period for the husband or father to bring the charge. After that, anybody in the general public could bring the charge of adultery, including the father or husband if for some reason they missed the 60-day period. That means that the neighbor, the baker, your local horse stable cleaner, the pea collector, anybody could bring the charge of adultery. However, the charge must be brought within 6 months. If no charge was made, the woman would have immunity. It does not appear that there was a time limit of accusing a man of adultery. For example, per the Lex Julia, a second husband could bring the charge of adultery against his new wife if he discovered that she was involved in a prior affair, but only if her lover at that time was charged and found guilty first. The Lex Julia is full of many similarly confusing laws, but for the sake of time, I will not get into them. Assuming the charges made past muster, the trial would commence. If you were an average person, the trial would be held before what we would consider a judge, and a jury would be impaneled. If you were rich, your trial would likely be before the Senate, with the senators acting as jurors. Later on in the empire, the emperor himself would hear cases and assemble juries to assist him. We're not there yet, and since most people were poor like me, we're going to talk about how the process worked for your average person. The jury for the average person varied in size depending on the location and the time of the trial, and by time, I mean years. In the early days, we have references to a jury of 25, later 32, and even later as large as 75. To make it fair, the Roman juries in general consisted of members of each class, that is, plebes, poor people like me, equestrians, knights, and patricians, fancy rich senators. The prosecution would set forth the charge with the accusing witness, and the court would determine whether the charge could go forward or whether it should be dismissed outright. Anyone who's ever gotten a traffic ticket will be familiar with this next step. If the prosecution or the accusing witness did not show up, the matter would be dismissed, barring some legitimate excuse such as military service or illness. Assuming they showed up, the accused would then have people, generally more than one, give speeches on his or her behalf. These people were sometimes lawyers, sometimes they were lay people. Just as they are today, witnesses would be examined and then cross-examined. Evidence was introduced by both sides, and at the conclusion of the entry of the evidence, closing statements would be made in support of each party's position. After closing arguments were made, the jury would deliberate and cast anonymous votes as to whether the accused was actually guilty. A simple majority vote was needed. If there was a tie, the accused was declared innocent. If found guilty, sentencing commenced. Sentencing was set forth by the Lex Julia. A woman, if found guilty, under the laws, would lose a third of her wealth and half of her dowry, which would go to her husband. She would be banned from remarrying, and best off, she would be banished to an island. A man found guilty would lose half of his money and would be legally blacklisted. He could not be a witness in any legal matter and could not inherit anything or bequeath anything to anybody else. He would also be banished to a separate island. Knowing this, it is very clear why Rome became an empire. They needed a lot of islands. I do have a specific case that was tried about 100 years after the first adultery laws were passed. The case was recorded by Pliny the Younger. Pliny is the same guy who watched Mount Vesuvius erupt from an island off of the coast of Italy and watched the city of Pompeii be consumed by the fires of hell. The case at hand concerned a woman charged with adultery named Gallita. As luck would have it, the Emperor Trajan, who built this thing, and this thing, and this thing, as well as this thing, and this thing, was in town in northern Italy and was himself hearing cases. I will leave Pliny to his own words. Next day, the case of Gallita was heard, who was charged with adultery. This lady, the wife of a military tribune and candidate for office, had stained her own and her husband's reputation by way of an affair with a centurion. The husband had written to the consular legate, and he to Caesar. Caesar, after sifting the evidence, cashiered the centurion and banished him into the bargain. There still remained a balance of punishment due to an offense which could only be committed by two persons. But the husband was kept back, not without incurring some censure for his forbearance, by the love for his wife, whom he had indeed kept in his house even after information had been laid of the adultery, as though satisfied with having removed his rival. Admonished that he must go through with his charge, he did so very unwillingly. However, her condemnation was unavoidable, unwilling as the prosecutor might be. She was convicted and left to the penalties of the Lex Julia. Caesar added to his judgment both the name of the centurion and a reference to military practice, that he might not seem to reserve for his own cognizance all cases of this kind. To translate, it appears that after the lover was convicted, the husband was fine letting things be and was satisfied that his honor was restored. However, he angered the judge in his unwillingness to prosecute his wife, and unfortunately, the judge was no mere judge. He was the most powerful man in the world, arguably, who was on his way home from pillaging the Balkans after a successful campaign. Reluctantly, the husband had to let the trial against his wife proceed. She was found guilty and banished to an island. Now, Augustus's laws created other sex crimes, including incest, debauchery, male homosexuality, and all sorts of other things that I intend on covering in future videos. For now, thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in again to learn more about the laws of history.